I'm going to start the recording a couple of minutes early, folks, because I just wanted to say hi to Jack Christensen. Hello, Jack. Can you hear me? I'm hoping Jack's on the program today, and it's always a special pleasure when we have our guest Jack Christensen in the house. And I'm going to see if I can get Jack to say a few words. We're seeing if he's can come online, folks. So. We're about officially about 2 minutes away from starting today's program, and thanks everybody for being here. We got a few people trickling in. George, like I always say, it's like church. Everybody knows how long it takes to get to church, and so at 5 minutes to 8, it's empty, and at 8:02, it's not empty. So, so anyway, we'll get started here in a minute or so. So thanks everybody for being here today. And I guess Roy, I'm not going to get Jack on here. So, at some point in time, we always gotta it's always good to check in with Jack, and we'll see what's doing. I don't know what those hand signals, George. I never worked in train service, so it's hard for me to.
No, I was just going to say it was like we got to poke the bear, so we got to poke Jack. Jack, can you hear us, buddy?
Well, that's what I'm doing. Jack, can you hear us? I think Jack can hear us, but Jack isn't able to get any volume himself. So, it's always, I don't think anybody is in a hurry. I know, George, I was going to tell you this. I watched this Mid-Atlantic NRHS program with Rick Panisi doing a presentation on the Erie Lackawanna. And my God, they start at 8 Eastern time. And 2.5 hours later, they're still going strong. I mean, these things just go on all night long. It's just amazing. So
Wow.
anyway, we're right at the top of the hour. And so, Jack, if you ever figure out how to get some volume, you're always welcome to chime in. In the meantime, Jack, it's great to see you. And we're going, George II is here, so that's always good. Roy, your buddy from Eugene. And so a couple more people are coming in. So nice to have everybody here on a beautiful May Wednesday. So, all right, we're 101. Hi, everybody. I'm Jonathan Fisher, the host and moderator of the Pacific Northwest Railroad Archive Program for May 21st, 2025. Thanks, everybody, for being here. And we've got a double feature today. So, both focused on the Golden State route of the Rock Island / Southern Pacific with a longtime railroad veteran, Roy Gelder, with us. And Roy will be talking about it. And then Roy and I have been longtime friends. So I went down to deep in the heart of Texas last year and took a few pictures. And we'll look at those at the end as kind of the second feature. So we have two programs left in our program for this year or for this spring, and then we go on our summer hiatus. Scheduled to appear June 4th, Robert W. Scott, good friend of mine, he will be doing a regional rail fan camera update. Say that 5 times fast. There's a camera that he works at in Centennial, his main camera, which he started in Chehalis, Washington, and he's involved with the folks in Ritzville. Now, breaking news, breaking news. We're going to have a special guest. We're planning to have a special guest at our June 4th meeting. And this is, tell your friends. It's kind of important. Bethan Mayer, the executive director of the Mount Rainier Scenic Railway will be with us. Um, she had kind of a good day and a bad day all on the same day. They got ownership of their property again. And on the same day, somebody burned one of their big trestles down on the way to Morton. So this will be a very interesting program. She's a dear friend and a special guest friend of mine. And so it'll be great having her on here. And then June 18th, PNRA past board president Bob Kelly will be with us, and Bob will be doing a presentation on how to create a railroad book. And I know Kurt Armbruster is in the audience today, and of course, Kurt is an expert on this topic as well. And Bob recently published a book on Argus cameras, and so he'll be talking about some of the trends and techniques and how do you go about this. So for you budding authors, this will be an opportunity for you to figure out how to get the Great American Train Story into print after all of these years. So with that in mind, that's kind of what we've got on the agenda for the rest of the year. I can tell you this fall, um, I've, I've, I've had a couple of people sign up for this fall. I've only got a couple, I'm starting to work on the calendar. September 3rd, Scott Lotus, Executive Director of Center for Railroad Photography and Art. He kicked off our program this current year. Rick Panisi will be talking about the Delaware and Hudson. Gordon Glattenberg will be back with us talking about Central American steam locomotives. And Margaret Weatherby, head of archives for the Washington State Historical Society. So she's a big guest. And so we'll that was a reschedule from a couple of years ago. And so that's kind of what we've got on the agenda. And some of you in the audience know that I've talked to you in the past, and your turn is coming. The pen that razor sharp pendulum is swinging your way. You just know it. So with that in mind, enough of my. Oh, I do want to just mention this. There, I've shared my screen. Okay. So this is going to be on the move here fairly shortly. And so when I do that, the rest of you will, of course, know. In fact, we might even see something about that at our next meeting. So with that in mind, I am going to, and there'll be applause when I do this. I'll be muting myself, and I'm going to turn the program over to Roy Gelder, my good friend from like a million years. And Roy, let's talk about the Golden State Route.
Okay, we'll share the screen here. Hopefully you all can see that.
You haven't shared yet.
I
And
haven't
in the
shared.
audience, if you guys can
Oh, I'm sorry. Right. Share. Down
mute your
there, nice blue
cameras and
button.
stuff like that, that kind of helps us save on bandwidth. So,
There.
okay, from the beginning and
Begin.
take it away.
Okay, well, thanks everybody. This is we're going to discuss the SPs and the condition, the Rock Island's Golden State Route, and it kind of broke it into four categories. First, a little bit of background about the SP, Southern Pacific, the Rock Island, and some specifics about the Golden State Route. And then we'll talk about the conveyance process to the SP. We'll talk about the route's rehabilitation in 1980 and 81, and then the rehabilitation of Armourdale Yard, which was the eastern terminus in Kansas City, Kansas, in 1982 and 1983. So here's a map of Southern Pacific in 1981, which in the yellow is the historical components of the Golden State Route from Los Angeles on the left to Chicago. The orange in the upper right, the orange dash, is the portion of the Golden State Route which the Southern Pacific eventually did not purchase. It found a new life in use by the portions of the Chicago Northwestern, the Milwaukee, and part of the Iowa Interstate and CSX across Illinois. The red line in the middle there is the St. Louis line, which ceased operations as a through route before SP got a hold of the line. But the yellow is the Golden State Route, and most prominently transited by the Golden State and the Imperial passenger trains. But that's the entirety of the railroad. The portion that was purchased by SP, as we'll learn later, was that portion from Tucumcari, New Mexico, in the middle up to Topeka, Kansas, and then the associated trackage rights. Now, on the Union Pacific between Topeka and KC. So, a little bit about SP. There's really no other way to say it, but in the 60s, Southern Pacific was riding high. They were a significant landowner in California, not just through land grants, but also through purchases on their own account. They had something like a single digit, but middle single digit proportion of the entire state's land area was owned by SP. Pipelines, TOPS, their a pioneer computer system, and a growing demographic that was absorbing everything the SP could haul into the state, basically. They also had a long tradition of promoting from within, being a stable and a large company that they sort of fell into that groove. This was for the first 3/4 of the 20th century. They were led by folks primarily, the bulk of them were within internally generated, and their background may or may not have been the best for the time. This was, by 2 interviews I've done with people, mentioned as a specific reason for the SP CSL Chessie merger failure in the mid 80s. They just simply didn't like the leadership quality. For all intents and purposes, it was kind of a lack of reporting of bad news to the top. And some of that was due to the cultural difference between what they called on the SP, the TNL, the Texas and Louisiana lines, and the Pacific lines. There was a different aura between the two. The TNL had a bit of a defiance and insularity characteristic that was. Oh, can you hear me? Okay. Okay. The TNL and the Pacific lines
keep going. I'll take care of it.
That's fine. Had a difference of management styles. There was, and it bore out particularly. The most interesting example is when business turned down, the TNL sort of had a very close-knit way of dealing with reductions in force and reductions in capex, whereas the Pacific lines was a little bit more diverse and a little bit more open-handed about what they were trying to do. The diversification and investment, Southern Pacific developed its telecommunications system, which generated the company we all know as Sprint. That was a direct offshoot of SP's microwave system and began to absorb capital at a much greater rate even than the railroad. They bought Ticor, which was a title insurance company in Los Angeles. They never did really spin off their resources like UP did. The upshot was that they generated diversification maybe in ways that didn't necessarily support what the railroad needed. And in deregulation, it was impossible, like in the mid 70s, to see a article about deregulation that didn't have a quote about from Ben Biaggi, the chairman of SP, about how great deregulation was going to be. And he wasn't alone in this. There were a lot of people that thought that, but really didn't know what deregulation was going to mean. Among other things, deregulation meant that that prices were going to be much more competitive, and that if you had a tariff, that wasn't going to govern. What was going to govern was a contract. So, for instance, an auto rack that you were getting $6,000 for moving from East St. Louis to Los Angeles, all of a sudden that was worth about $1,500. So, huge revenue drops in many competitive categories that weren't captive, and also. When something was locked up or traffic was attracted to a railroad, it was by contract, and you couldn't wrest that business away the old-fashioned way with taking them to dinner or anything. You had to wait for the contract to go. So it was definitely a two-edged sword that some railroads were more able to weather than others. The marketing issues with SP, it came in with sales and marketing. They hired a very good marketing guy who came up with a somewhat fallacious revenue forecast for 1979, and that resulted, instead of a gain in revenue which the marketing people forecasted, because there was actually a 25 to 30% shortfall in revenue. And so there was a loss of credibility in the marketing people at a critical time when the company needed to be focused outward on what people needed versus inward on what the SP thought they could just deliver as good old operating folks. And the operating results showed it. In 1976, there was a $303 million cash flow. That cash flow was minus $4 million in 1984. And many of the marketing and sales people that I discussed this with said in the early 80s, basically about half of 50% of SP's traffic was operating at or below long-run variable cost. In other words, it was paying the out-of-pocket expense and paying some of the equipment rents, but it wasn't paying for the fixed costs, the long run costs of renewal. So there were some issues bubbling at Southern Pacific. Now, on the Rock Island is an interesting case of Granger Railroading. One of the first presidents of the railroad by the name of Ransom Cable expanded the railroad dramatically in the 1870s to 1893 by buying a lot of branch lines, feeders. He extended routes to major cities like Minneapolis, Denver, and Chicago, and Kansas City, but he did it through trackage rights. He didn't have his own direct routes. And as in many cases, he was somewhat a Johnny-come-lately on some of these marketing points. It was subsequently taken over by the Reed Moore Syndicate, a group of investors in 1901 to 1909, and that you might correlate that time with what was going on at Union Pacific when Mr. Harriman was rebuilding the railroad from one end to the other. And the Rock Island instead had a strong cash position dissipated through speculation in Frisco, SLSF, and Chicago and Alton stock. Whether it was intended as an expansion or as simply speculation, it didn't matter. The money was gone, and so what could have gone into the railroad didn't. There was a first bankruptcy in 1913 and 1915, and then a second one in the 20th century in 1932. Now, out of that came some notable leadership. John Dow Farrington was vice president of operations during that time, and he became president when the railroad emerged from bankruptcy in 1948, and started a period of remarkable investment and growth. And you're going to see some of the results of that in Jonathan's bonus content later. But in addition to Farrington, there was Downing Jenks from 1956 to 61, who subsequently went on to stardom and stellar performance at Missouri Pacific. There was John Barringer, who was one of his VPs, John Barringer III, the doctor of sick railroads. There was Jervis Langdon, who was brought in by a major bondholder, Henry Crown, and Jervis Langdon came in 1965 with the express intention of making the UP merger work. But so there was some excellent leadership, but the fact was they just didn't have a lot of density. They were focused on agricultural products. The two segments, Chicago to the Quad Cities and Kansas City to Harrington, were the only two segments on the entire 8,000 miles of railroad that had traffic in excess of 20 million gross ton miles, which is a pretty fundamental cutoff. In Iowa, for example, I've got them listed here: Rock Island, Northwestern, Minneapolis, St. Louis, the Great Western, the Burlington, the IC, Milwaukee, and the Wabash all had about 10,000 miles of track in the state. 22% of those miles were Rock Island. So they had a good 1910 railroad, but it was not capitalized or dense enough to support a mid-century operation. In June of 1962, the Rock Island announced that they were planning to merge with the Southern Pacific. And so we began. In September of that year, which is interesting, UP announced that they planned to merge with the Rock Island and sell the south half to the SP. And this was the beginning of the infamous Rock Island merger case. Apparently there was a clear perception that the railroad was unlikely to survive on its own. So this sort of introduced three people, this merger case, that were going to be major players. Ben Heineman of the CNW came off the Minneapolis and St. Louis, and he was dead set that this merger was not going to happen because the CNW's lifeline was the UP interchange at Council Bluffs. It was an absolute critical, it was fundamental to their existence. And they did not want to see the UP gain entrance to Chicago and lose that traffic. The next person that we're going to meet is Harry Crown, who was a large stockholder of Rock Island, and he was dead set on preserving his equity, even to the point of liquidating the company. He's a guy that was a large player in Chicago politics and Chicago business, and he moved his money around, and this was an investment he made, and he was going to get his money back. And the third guy we're going to meet is Frank Barnett, who is somewhat the representative UP management in this case at this time, who is absolutely dead set against making any deals with any other carriers to make the merger palatable. And he, to Jervis Langdon, is quoted in a couple of volumes, to Jervis Lang. He said, "Don't worry about it. We'll let the lawyers sort it out," which is exactly what happened. That's what some of the result is. And in the end, if you reflect on it as we get to the end of this, you'll see all these three people each got what they wanted. So, 12 years later, after the application was filed, about actually 11 years, the ICC issued its preliminary plan, which was called the Clatinic Plan, and it was not just a merger approval; it was a wholesale reshuffling of routes, ownerships, and connections in the entire western 2/3 of the United States. It was like the guy was off the merger thing, and he was more into reorganizing railroad, and he was more concerned about preserving competitors, if you will, than preserving competition. If you can see that inflection. There was a second ICC decision in November of '74, which the UP totally rejected as well. The UP backed out, and Rock Island was left on its own because SP had sent the merger oversight over to the UP, and so the SP couldn't step in, and it was like the Rock Island was on its own. In the meantime, the slow order count on the Rock Island had swelled from 500 miles in '67 to 2,300 miles, fully at least a quarter to a third of the system. And they were refused repeated loans by the FRA because the FRA began to see by 1975 and 1976 that there were a lot of railroads going wherever the Rock Island went. And so they were refused two loans of $100 million and $390 million simply because they weren't figured to be a good credit risk. And now Mother Nature begins to step in. The winter of 1978, 79 buried the Rock Island basically from every point north of Oklahoma City, which is the northern 2/3 of the system, was buried in one of the worst winters on record. In August of '79, now there was a strike. The Rock Island had told all their unions, and at that time most unions organized their agreements to lapse at the same time. And the Rock Island had agreements with most everybody that we can't give you cost of living. We can meet the new industry standard wages effective after 1977 or into 1978 and onward. We can meet that new rate, but we can't pay you the back pay, which is about 2 years worth at that time. And everybody agreed except the clerks, and the UTU had agreed, but they honored the picket line, and the BRAC folks went out in August of 1979. And of course, at this point, there's a harvest to be gathered on the west end of the Rock Island, and that gets into pretty sensitive politics, of course. And Carter basically ordered the UTU and the railway clerks back to work. The UTU went, and their clerks chose not to. So this is by now September and October of 1979. And Carter ordered the Department of Transportation to implement directed service with the owners of the Kansas City terminal, being a quick organization that could bring in a number of carriers that bordered the Rock Island, the MOP, the Frisco, the BN, the Santa Fe, UP, even Norfolk Southern. There were all the owners of the terminal began to work pieces of the Rock Island, and they were compensated by the federal government for that work. And to the tune of about $500,000 a day to operate the railroad for the 150 odd days. In January of 1980, there was a Rock Island Employee Assistance Act was passed that provided by interim service by carriers like the Chicago Northwestern and the Cotton Belt, which were directly interested and were well advanced in negotiating purchases of the railroad. So even at the time of January 1980, that you could, if you were within the Rock Island, you could see the railroad being dismembered or about to be. So the SP began actually interim service on the Rock Island line on March 23rd of 1980. The ICC issued their final order on May 23rd to say that it was to be abandoned, and the Rock Island went silent on May 23rd, 1980. So that's when they ceased operations. So now, what did the SP get? This map is an enlargement of that map we saw at the get-go. You see the lower left is a green line that kind of runs off the page. That is also Rock Island Route between Tucumcari, about 60 miles west to a place called Santa Rosa. That was That was built by the Rock Island along with the Golden State Route to a connection with a company called the El Paso and Northeastern in 1902. Subsequently, to save construction cost, the Rock Island leased that segment, Santa Rosa to Tucumcari, to the El Paso Northeastern, which was at that point becoming part of SP. And that became SP operated and leased to the Rock Island. And of course, there was the Rock Island ownership between Tucumcari and about 440 miles northeastward to Topeka, Kansas, and then the subsequent rights on the Union Pacific Marysville sub between Topeka and Kansas City. The red line was, of course, the Missouri line. That never operated as a through route after August of 1979 when the BRAC strike ensued. And it had only intermittent operations from that point to shutdown. So you can see on the map here, it's a fairly straight railroad. The straight portion is the yellow highlight between Dalhart and Guyman, which is 71 miles of tangent track, the second longest straight in the country. And the numbers stack up well. I mean, the Golden State Route has a 6,700 foot summit. It's around Leoncito on the SP in New Mexico. Its length is 2,274 miles versus about 2,223 for the Santa Fe, and about the same for the Union Pacific. And the passenger trains we talked about were carded at 42 hours, Chicago to Los Angeles. It had competitive chops, but the traffic had declined. SP purchased the Cotton Belt in 1932, and after that, this interchange began to be downgraded. But still, in 1970, there were 130,000 cars interchanged at Tucumcari between the two carriers. And by 1975, when the Rock Island declared bankruptcy, it was down to about 45,000, and it was basically a zip by 1980. It shut down. On this railroad, Farrington's VP operations, who was hired from the SP Eastern Lines, a fellow by the name of Kelly, invested in this route significantly. He put about 23 9,000 foot sidings on this route between Tucumcari and Topeka. And if you kind of squint down at the map, you can see there's one at Obar, Romero, King, Conlin. They're spaced about every 18 to 20 miles on that map, all the way to Topeka. It was ABS train order territory. And he also, there had been capital investment by Farrington in the construction of the River Bridge near Kismet, which you'll see a picture of a little later. So there had been a lot of investment on this line, but there hadn't been the density to keep it up. So we paid $57 million for it, and the SP spent about $50 million of its own money and got a $48 million preference loan from the 4R to rehabilitate it. And basically you had some big issues here. The Rock Island had double track between Topeka and Harrington, the first crew change, which was basically down to one track and was virtually impassable. The east end is the wet end, and the west end is the dry end. And so the gang started between Hutch and Topeka. It's about 156 miles. The bulk of that was plowed out. It had to be plowed out, and bulk of it had to have a tie gang go over it just to make it passable, so they could dare to lift the track for the plow. But the railroad was broken up into elements or sections based on a combination of factors as to the need, the logistics of getting material there, a lot of factors. But it was broken up in sections so that we could concentrate on getting the work done in an organized way. And here's what one of these plows is, if you've never seen one. There's the motive power that pulls it on the right, and it's got a, believe it or not, it's with a large cable. And the plow has got jacks. You can see right here on the left-hand side and more or less in the middle that lifts the track up, picks the rail up, and hopefully the ties come with it, which was the heart of the matter on the Rock Island. And these plow blades are the angled rods you see at the one end, and those are dug in, and then the blades dug in make a plow V, and that's just pulled by the locomotives, and all the dirt is basically pushed to the side. It's a slow process. Once you get going, it goes fairly fast, but this was what they had to do the entire 150 odd miles of the railroad on the east end. No labor concessions were asked for this project. No property tax abatements were asked. It was simply a cash deal to buy the railroad and fix it with SP personnel. And so there was no, if you will, grabbing going on as part of this project. So the rehabilitation, I got there in April of '81, and by the time I got there, my job was to run ballast trains. They were using a lot of stone, and in '81, beginning about March, they had started between Hutchinson, Kansas, west to Tucumcari, New Mexico. It's about 393 miles, and the job was the main personnel included Mike Christensen, Ray B. Wallen, who recently passed away, an element foreman off the SP and SSW, and some from the Rock Island. And my portion of it was to keep these stone trains rotating. One set usually at the pit. The pit was at Vaughn, New Mexico, about 120 odd miles west of Tucumcari, and one set en route to the gangs, and then one set being emptied by the gangs and routed back west. And those gangs would they would receive a train, and we'd split the train into two 30 to 40 car cuts. And they would drop the stone, and then we'd assemble the train up and send it back east, or send it back west, rather. My estimate was the tie renewal over the entirety was probably 75%. On the east end, it was probably closer to 90 to 100%, and about 1.2 million tons of stone placed. Our standard power was this: 4 SPU 33Cs, which operated between Tucumcari and the pit, because that's where the grades were. They were more or less reliable in 1980 and '81. They were fairly good power, and they had an excellent electrical system and traction motor. And the cars were mainly these two: the 463 series roll down car and the 464 series plain hopper car, which had chains welded to the hopper base so that they could control the flow. And you can contrast this equipment with what you see on any Class 1 these days, with their remotely controlled, electrically powered, gates with all sorts of technology on them. And this was basically hardcore, get the stone on the ground. And it was done by basically, where the blue arrow is, you take a new tie, never an old one, because they break. A new tie, place it up against the wheel, and then open the gate a little bit and flood the crib of the track and pull the train. And that's how we smoothed the stone out and regulated the stone drop. The tie gangs followed. There are 2 tie gangs combined each on east and west, and that's how the track was resurfaced after the tie gangs were there. And this is the ballast load leaving Tucumcari, and that's what the railroad looked like after it was done. As one guy said, the stone's on top of the dirt, the ties are on top of the stone, and the rail's on top of the ties. It was sort of a new thing, but this is what it looked like when we were done. Here's some of the ballast train. You can see how the crib of the railroad has been filled with stone, and this is a loaded train moving through to be unloaded. Here's another loaded train at Goodwell, mile 47, and as you can see, sometimes the U-33s all made it. Sometimes we had to supplement the power. And then at the other end, like this is in Pratt, for example, when the stone was dropped, it was usually with 2 or 3 Jeeps, and they had enough gumption to pull the stone as we dropped it. And they would return the empties to the nearest crew change point, where they would be picked up by our through power to go back down to the pit. And so we cycled these cars back and forth. And here's an empty train that somehow accumulated a little more power than it should have, going back eastward through Dalhart. Westward through Dalhart at a place called Conlin. And you can see over here on the right is the pole line for US Highway 54. And it's the railroad and the highway run like this for a couple hundred miles. It's just you drive your car and you get off and walk right over to it. But that's somewhat, and you can see it's still jointed rail. In the mid 80s, or I forget when it was now, 90s maybe, this was all butt welded. We used the largest application of a Holland welder to that date. They cropped and butt welded this entire railroad. They didn't have enough money for CWR, but they basically field welded the whole thing. And here's the ballast crew meeting with, if you will, the Golden Rock at the West Sitch at Goodwill, Oklahoma, in the middle of October of 1981. And so what did we get? Well, these train sizes almost seem quaint these days. It's the railroad, basically, we had a lot of grain moving. And so 9,000 tons maximum west of Dalhart, 12,000 tons east. And but a lot of grain originated between Liberal and Hutchinson, just east of Dalhart. And so there was almost insatiable demand for power. There was a very heavy, lucrative business of interchange of BN at Dalhart, Coors Beer being among them. That's the reason the Missouri Pacific SD 40-2 is on there. Is I was acting trainmaster at Dalhart for a little while, and it got so there was so much beer built up that I actually begged for mop units out of El Paso, and they came up to clear the yard out. That's why there's a mop unit there. It kind of saved our bacon. But it was a 440-mile railroad at the end of another 300 odd mile railroad between El Paso to Tucumcari. That there was there was a long way to go, and there was a lot of intervening opportunities for power to be used. And SP always had power short in that time, but that's what we had. We also had great track. There was been at 440 miles. There's about 20 miles of curves and at grade crossings, most of which are gone now. But the rest of it was 60 to 70 mile an hour road. So it was, it was good piece of railroad. And here is the premier train, the LA-CHT, midday operating west of Liberal, LA, Chicago. So he's eastward. He's got his reefers tucked in behind the power, and he'll run through from the BN to the BN in Kansas City and go on to Chicago. So Armourdale, this is the place where that interchange was made. Armourdale was basically the first hump built by Dow by Farrington, and in 1948. And I've sketched this out so you can get a sense of what the railroad looked like. It was a couple miles long, and there's on the left you can see where the UP main track goes through. When the tail tracks connect to it, and that's where we go on the UP to get to Topeka. There's a classification yard of 43 tracks. The receiving yard is in the middle, so that received trains from all over the Rock Island, both from the west and from the east. And they were received and worked there and pulled back to the hump and then shoved over from the west end eastward. There's a small transfer yard for Kansas City terminal business. There's a departure yard, which we called the fruit yard, about 6 tracks where everything was pulled down out of the class yard and then again would depart east or west. And then there was car repair and local support. And interestingly, there was also an on-truck wheel truing machine. So we had locomotives needed a flat wheel, had a flat wheel on it. We could actually turn the wheel on the locomotive without dropping the wheel set. And we had interchange with Santa Fe, BN, Northwestern, the IC, KCS, Terminal, Milwaukee, the Katy, the MOP, the Norfolk and Western, the Frisco, which is then coming BN, and the UP. So there's a lot of interchange business too. There was just about, with the coal trains, there was just about the same tonnage through Kansas City as there was through Chicago in about 1/10 of the area. If you look at it from a ton standpoint, there was a lot of traffic. Now, yard operations are really kind of interesting. And this is a bit of an eye test, but I just want you to notice that, and the upper portion here, which we know is our receiving yard, where the tracks are widely spaced, and you got a transfer yard, and then you've got below the transfer yard, you've got this departure yard, and they connected up through these series of 4 leads and this pocket track that allowed both bidirectional traffic out of the class yard into departure, along with departure of trains and classification and departure and pulling of the receiving yard out to the bowl, to the hump to be classified. And there was, they had a ladder lead, an ice house lead, a fruit lead, which is what the departure yard was called, was a fruit yard, and a train yard lead. The acronym was LIFT. And so there was a really nice, understandably, it was structured for 40-foot, 70-ton equipment, but it was a very flexible design that had served the Rock Island pretty well, although it was obviously, by the time I got there, half of these leads weren't in service because they just hadn't been maintained. But the SP operations began in 80, basically with 1 train a day each way through this yard. The CHLAT, LACHT began in 1981 with a connection with the BN. And we began to build the traffic train by train going forward. But the Armourdale was pretty run down, and the first thing it needed was some rehabilitation. It was in the bow of the Kansas River. It was kind of low, and the first order of business was a significant drainage system with about a 6 or 7 foot drain tile that went down the yard. The $16 million FRA loan, which was used to completely rehabilitate the receiving tracks, were rebuilt with 136-pound rail, new number 9 turnouts for the leads, number 10s for the crossovers, and the CWR. Some of it was relay, some of it was new, and it was a proper rebuild. And here you see one of our switchmen, Mike Chilson, protected the shove on a ribbon rail train to go out to the west end and drop some more ribbon rail. You can see in the foreground where we've already rehabbed the middle of the portion of the yard, where the leads came together in the middle. And they did that because the hump was cut. The hump was bulldozed down, and the tracks were stub-ended on the west, and the leads were simplified. And then the leads were cut off basically about halfway down their length and replaced with crossovers. And this was a case of an interesting case of the management at SP seeing this yard as a through yard and having a service plan in mind circa 1981 about what they wanted to do, because they wanted to divert traffic, high value traffic, off the Cotton Belt over to the Kansas City division. They anticipated getting trackage rights on the Missouri Pacific, Union Pacific, between St. Louis and Kansas City, which they did. And so this was going to be an area where some hot trains could be worked or pass through. And so they didn't perceive the yard as a switching yard so much as a run-through yard. So they had a service plan figured out based on what they thought they would be diverting, and they designed the yard somewhat around, well, not more than somewhat. They designed the yard more or less around that. And of course, these crossovers, I'm going to show you a picture here from Google Earth. If you can squint, the crossovers basically replaced this area with the blue line right here. That's where the lead used to go. This is 18th Street, and there's where the lead used to go. And the tracks were extended westward, where they were joined with these number 10 crossovers. And this is a 1991 aerial photo, and they've dutifully pulled the train out so we can see clearly what the length implications are. That's about 20 to 25 cars of additional length to pull from the yard and into the receiving and into what was these case, the departure tracks. So the classification capability for interchange with carriers in Kansas City was somewhat reduced, but not too badly. But the requirement to reach in and pull out and shove again, and then reach in and double up and pull out and shove back was greatly accentuated. And you had basically a switching lead through crossovers, which isn't most of the switching still took place down near 18th Street. But this was something of an operational headache. And it was a learning process for me to watch how a service plan began to evolve into a yard design, when really a better yard design might have been to simply rehab mostly what was already there, and then use the flexibility to run the place. So be that as it may, here we are. In 1983, the SP got the rights over the MOP the UP between St. Louis and Kansas City, and the Blue Streak Merchandise, SP's premier train, the APLAA, which was an auto parts train at that time, beginning to be something less than pure auto parts, and the LA to East St. Louis trailers, which was colloquially known as the Merchandise, all rerouted to the Kansas City division began in early '83. And also the interchange began to grow. And now we'll pause with the interchange. This was an interesting corollary, because one of the major interchanges the SP got here was with Chicago Northwestern, and they got that through an interesting problem. When the UP agreed to fund CNW expansion to the Powder River Basin, the CNW granted them the right to solicit traffic on the CNW that would be interchanged to the UP. So UP sales folks got to go on the CNW and solicit traffic. That didn't necessarily please some of the CNW salespeople who began to work with SP. And we ended up getting a lot of overland route traffic through Armourdale. Nice traffic, corn oil manufacturers, good traffic. And so it was highly rated, and it brought us a lot of business. And this began to develop the Central Corridor, especially after El Nino, which I think was 83 or 84. And the overland route using Missouri Pacific trackage rights in concert with the Rio Grande began to happen well before the Rio Grande merger in 87. So, but anyway, this is nerve central at Armourdale. That you can see it's 10:30 at night. The guy with the back to us is Frank Kyle, the yard master, and that's me when I had dark hair. And another gentleman over there to the right who was one of our clerks, and I am sad to say I didn't write the gentleman's name down, but he was up in the tower. We were doing a turnover and getting ready for the night's fun. This was our high-tech turnover system at Armourdale, circa 1983, and you can see the writing here. Some of mine on the left, and the Daylight Brothers on the right, and that's how we kept track of things. And then here's some photographs. So this is a second section of the CHLAT, which happens sometimes. He's being made up in those long middle tracks called the fruit yard. The C&W caboose is at the top end of the train yard, and you can see beyond it cars in the transfer receiving yard like that. And so he's frequently when the CHLAT ran two sections, it was LA first off the BN connection, and then this was probably a fellow made up of from our ramp traffic like Kansas City, and also traffic made up off of interchange. So not too often, but it happened a lot. Here's at the west end on the left, we have a CHLAT, the hottest train on the railroad, heading out to Cod Junction. That's a KCS bridge overhead. And you can see how we've done a pretty nice job on the track as well. On the right is the first Sioux Line run through double stack train. The one thing that we did do well at Armourdale was we oriented some of those arrival and departure tracks right close to the UP main, so you could come in, and with the new agreements, you could yard the train in two places if it wouldn't fit in the first place in the one track. So we could bring these double stack trains in, split them, reduce the rear end if need be, have road power stationed in two places, get on and run one train, as this Sioux Line man is doing. He's on the KC Terminal High Line, which we'll see another picture of, to head east, and another one leave out through the yard where this guy is and go east over the bridge and over towards Missouri. So it got to be a lot of fun to railroad. Here's a picture of leaving Armourdale on the low line, if we will. Here's the high line up here, going over the Kaw River Bridge. This is like it's got to be the only two-level four-track railroad bridge I know of. And these, I don't have a better picture of them, but these MP15 ACs with the road trucks and the heavier everything are hands down the best end cap switcher I've ever worked with. And they came to Armourdale after a cold winter in '84 when the SW 1500s froze up. Subsequently, in a new life on the Belt Railway Company of Chicago, we remanufactured our two MP15 DCs at Altoona, which was doing the same thing, basically an AC refit. And they came back as an MP15 AC, only the belts were ballasted to 280,000 pounds, and they were real torque monsters. They really were. But so that's how this is a typical yard move leaving Armourdale. And here's a train on the High Line on the left, the first BSM, January 6th of '83. He's on the High Line headed west. An ESBAA with a Rio Grande motor in the lead on the UP at Edwardsville. He's probably just cleared the tail track out of the yard, so they're putting the coal to it. And the the Milwaukee to LA Auto Parts, which is where most of the parts came from anyway. He's at Cod Junction. By this time, the auto parts weren't coming to us at St. Louis so much as they were coming to us in Kansas City. And so the symbols changed and the traffic changed, and the yard could have kind of set up a little bit inflexibly. And here's the crew that did the work. The construction crew on on the top, the B&B folks and the drainage folks. And as they said, when the ground got cold in the winter, we just got a bigger backhoe. So this is about the end. Here's an LACHT. Everybody's on at Dalhart, Texas, and he's hauling ass up the first of the 71 miles of tangent track. Uh, I learned a lot on this railroad. Some of you have also had, major experiences in your railroad career where you learn disproportionately more than maybe you did earlier or later. And here I learned about, during harvest, an empty car is every bit as important as a load, which on the SP was people didn't really understand that, and I learned how a yard design has to work flexibly on its own and not be subservient to an operating plan. And actually, in Kansas City, we perfected a bit of an advanced consist capability where we learned what the interchange was a day before. And I was happy enough to take that to the BRC, which was all interchanged, and we were able to leverage some new AAR reporting, and we did some marvelous things with that forecasting ability to dispel the black hole reputation at that railroad later. So anyway, that's my everybody's on picture right there. Here's a list of additional reading for anybody interested. Lots of good stuff there. Main lines, the Union Pacific volumes by Maury Klein. This fellow Gregory Schneider, Rock Island Requiem, right there in the middle. I'll just say this real quick. He wrote that book. I forget the date. I've got it on the shelf here, but he wrote that book and he brought it to Chicago to a group called the Sandhouse Gang, which was a group of railroad people, some railroaders, some fans, some students at Northwestern. We met up in Evanston once every 2 months or so. And they had a speaker, and Gregory Schneider brought his book and did a presentation. And we advertised it a little bit ahead of time. Usually there was about 20 or 30 people would show up, which, pre-COVID days, this was pretty good turnout. And we began to get RSVPs that didn't stop. We changed the venue 3 times before we finally found a stadium-seated classroom that held something like 130 people, like you'd have Econ 101 or something. And I'm telling you, the people that showed up, it was everybody from engineers, brakemen, clerks, dispatchers, people from the law department that had argued some of the cases in front of the Supreme Court, John Riebensdorf of the Union Pacific, who knew every inch of the railroad, people who had been in the room all through this railroad's history. And, you'd never heard of these people before or since, really. But for the Rock Island, they came out. It was pretty amazing to listen to some of those folks. Anyway, I also recommend Roger Grant's Visionary Railroader, a biography of Jervis Langdon. He was a very interesting guy. And so I'm open to questions. That concludes my presentation. I will stop share.
Yeah, wasn't that great? I mean,
Thank you.
it's just wonderful. So, thank you, Roy. And we're gonna take a little bit of an intermission here for about 4 or 5 minutes, and then we'll start our second feature. And our second feature, just so that we're going to look at some of this trackage, and we're going to look at pictures from last year that I took, just as kind of a second program. So now, Jack Christensen, can I hear you? Are you there, Jack? So, yeah, okay. So anyway, let's just take a minute. Anybody wants to get up for a second? George, did you have something you wanted to bring up?
Well, I see Jack Fuller is on the line, and
Hey, yeah,
I
Jack.
work for Jack Fuller in Olsel Yard at Martinez occasionally, and so I remember him quite well. He was probably twice as tall as anybody else I've ever known, but yeah, Jack was a good guy. Just trying to butter you up there, Jack.
Yeah, I'm hearing that. I hear you.
Jack was my terminal superintendent at Armourdale as well. Excellent to work with, work for.
Flattery will get you everywhere.
A question from the audience was, I've always wondered why the SP didn't take the lead in the Rock Island merger instead of the UP. Think it would have gone easier. That's just a question we have.
It's uh, I'm I'll let Jack could butt in or anybody else, but I'm here to tell you that to me is the most that I bet that was one of the most interesting 3 months in the SP executive department in the company's history, between June and September, when it became an SP show and then it was a UP show. I would give my eye teeth to learn more about why that was. Um, I don't know. And you'd certainly, from the players involved, maybe a little bit of humility might have made it go a little smoother. But again, Ben Heineman, this was like a fire alarm in the middle of the night to him. His railroad was, and his company's survival was on the line. And so, it's hard to say. It's
So
hard to
Roy,
say.
coming back to your initial thesis, Heineman and the UP, the three guys that got what they want, who were those three guys and what did they, I don't think that they,
Well, Ben Heineman was from the Minneapolis and St. Louis. He's why the C&W bought the railroad. He kind of like,
so he
the
wanted to block
CN.
the UP and he
Yeah,
did.
kind of like this. Yeah, kind of like the CN bought the IC, right, for Hunter. But you know, Heineman he was a major player, politically and economically in Chicago, and he was determined to not let the C&W be aced out of its interchange at Omaha with the UP. The UP spread their traffic with Burlington a little bit, the Rock Island, and the
Milwaukee.
C&W,
I mean,
and
we
the
got some.
Milwaukee. But I'm talking the freight side, of course,
Yeah.
and so, if that had gone away, I mean, if that had gone away, the CNW might have been the one that went away, and not the Rock Island, because at one point the CNW laid CWR to be installed on the Overland Route that they had to pick back up and resell because they had to make payroll. Okay,
Oh
it
dear.
was that tight. So, and this is not a reflection on Heineman, but he felt he knew what he had to do. Now, the Union Pacific, whether it was through an insularity or basically an unwillingness to negotiate, simply didn't see that it. And I don't know, the effort may have been come a cropper the same way, but there was not any willingness on the part of the parties to pull these people together and say, how can we make this work instead of fighting this out in court?
And they would rather just fight it out. And so they
Right.
got what they wanted. They got a lot of legal fees.
Bingo.
Okay. And who was the third end of that tripod?
Henry Crown. Henry Crown bought
Now, how
Rock
did he
Island.
come out on this deal?
Well, Henry Crown bought his bonds when the Rock Island was in bankruptcy in 32. He was literally looking for an investment. He had a broken leg laid up at home. Oh, hey, looky here. That's in Jervis Langdon's book, by the way.
Oh,
And so,
okay.
and so Henry Crown became a major equity and bondholder in the Rock Island. And he wanted to preserve his asset too. He's the one that brought Jervis Langdon in for the purpose of getting the merger through. But he saw fairly soon how it probably wasn't going to be able to be reorganized after the ICC, approved the way it did. But in the end, he came out very well. It became the Rock Island, paid everybody off, much like the Chicago Milwaukee did, and he was fully compensated plus interest for his investment. So he
So
got
he
what
came out too. Okay.
he did.
All right. Hi, Jack. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, Jack Fuller. I've also got Jack Christensen.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well,
Sorry.
I'd like to
Jack
make a
Fuller, go
comment
ahead,
about,
please.
like
Yeah,
to make
go
a
ahead, Jack.
comment about Crown. He, like all the railroad executives in the 70s, realized that in that environment, you were not going to make money in the railroad business. So railroads diversified, they set up holding companies, and in the case of the Rock Island, he pressed for liquidation. But it was all because of the economic environment. Who knows what would have happened if that had all happened 10 years later?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
There you go. Good point.
Yep.
All right. So we've taken a little break and now it's time for our second feature. So let me see. This is your host trying to share. So I'm always, not the, I'm used to other people doing that. And Roy, now you're going to help me get through this thing, right?
Sure.
Okay.
Carry
So
right
here
on.
we are. We start out with a picture of, I went to Dalhart, Texas last October because I was so interested in Roy's story that I just kind of wanted to see this. And so this is Conlin, Texas. We saw a picture of it earlier, and is that Woody from Toy Story?
I don't know. It was there when I was there.
Yeah, it hasn't improved. So Guyman and Dalhart, that's a just a tangent, 70
Yep.
some miles of tangent, right?
71 miles. Yes.
Yeah. And then on the other side, we could see the map where we have now, you call it the Fort Worth and Denver City?
That was the earlier name, and it had stuck locally. The
Oh,
FW and DC. It became just the Fort Worth and Denver later under the Burlington, but it
so
was
so
initially.
what quadrant was your interchange in? This doesn't really show it.
Oh, it was the interchange would have been in the I believe Jack can correct me, but I believe it was in what would be in this cross. It would be the East Quadrant.
Oh,
Um,
okay.
yeah, they shoved around here, and then the yard was in the white space right into where it says US 54.
Yeah, that's
That's
where
where
the
the
yard
yard
is,
was.
all right. Yeah,
Right.
yeah.
And yep,
And
yep. It was
so
just a simple connection.
so the Rock Island doesn't really have any great, they have an underpass and then they have a couple little minor grade crossings and nothing, but the BN has got a grade crossing about every other block. And so
Yes.
when you heard trains at night, they warned me about this. They said, "Oh, I hope you don't mind that there's going to be trains." And I said, "No, it'll be okay." So
There
where are
it
we
is.
at, right?
That is the depot at Dalhart, Texas, on the Rock Island. The operator sat in this lower first floor 3 window bay right here. Up above was the trainmaster road foreman of engines office that was sparsely furnished, but was equipped with one thing, a dispatcher's wire. And it had a little speaker there, and you could turn it on and sit there. And within about 10 minutes of listening to train orders and goings on, you knew what was going on the railroad. It was the most miraculous thing I'd ever seen. And I loved it. Um, but
And, and
that's the depot at Dalhart. The
you,
interlocking for the BN Fort Worth Denver City is off the screen to the left.
right. And you lived there for how long while you were doing this track work with your
I,
wife?
yeah, we were there. We first were in Pratt, and then we were in Tucumcari, and then we moved to Dalhart about June, and we were there through the end of the project in November, or after the project, and then after I was trainmaster there for a little while.
Well, your wife deserves sainthood for more than one reason.
She lived in a motel the
Yeah.
whole time.
George Foster, did you have something?
Yeah, for Roy, I don't know if you're familiar with a guy named Gary Middleton, but Gary was a former rock engineer and maybe an officer. And when I traded seniority to LeGrand in '86, he and I used to talk about Delhart and some other points on the rock.
Yeah.
So pretty interesting guy. And of course, his stories reminded me a lot of the Milwaukee stories in the Northwest, basically living hand to mouth all the time, and everything. So it was
Yes.
just like listening to the Milwaukee folks talk.
And that's part of the reason I put that picture of the LACHT leaving Dalhart on the last slide. I mean, these guys they barely had a locomotive with all the traction motors online, and now they get stuff like this, and they had a great time.
Yeah, that's the way the Milwaukee was just before we started kind of taking over their railroad in '79 there in the fall. And basically when we went through, their trains were always in the hole because they kind of knew everything was going to be shut down. And but then 6 months later they finally got off the coast, so
That would be another great presentation to learn about how that process worked.
So Roy, there is a parallel there, which is that these railroads that were in poor condition, their crews were really good at what they did, right? Because it took everything they could do to stay on the rails.
And that's the other sentence on the bottom of that slide. These people would teach anybody anything who was willing to learn. It was easy. You walk up to these, you talk with these people, say, hey, how do you do this? They will show you. They were just some of the most professional people I've ever worked with.
So here's Dalhart. You can see that control signal for the diamond off to the right, and it just some motive power sitting there. It must be local power or extra power for something. And then this is the east end of Dalhart, right?
Yes. It's changed from that little simple hand throw switch.
So there's like a middle siding then that both the eastbound and the westbound guys kind of play the middle on, or how does that, or do you remember?
When I was there, it was a simple yard lead switch from the main track into the yard. I meant to look at Google Earth before this came on, but I know they've extended it east by probably a couple miles anyway.
Yeah, this was this was a good mile and a half east of town where this,
Right.
where this middle track kind of emerges from the other two.
Right. And of course, with SP, it was ABS, D and direct traffic control. UP's probably got CTC on the whole thing now.
I would think so, yeah. And here's that train just pulling into the yard.
Mm-hmm.
So we talked about this. We're going to get a chance to talk more about it, right? Archelon and the Samson of the Cimarron. I don't know, this sounds
right.
See, tell me more.
Right. The main track on the Rock Island used to go down into that river valley, and your subsequent pictures also show it. It was about, well, the outcome was when they put the bridge in, there was about a 3-mile equation in the timetable of track that just basically disappeared there. Because in the early days, it was actually a helper grade. There was a bridge at the bottom, which the Cimarron River dutifully washed out on a regular basis. And it was just otherwise an operating headache. But they never had, they dissipated the money. So Farrington, after they came out of bankruptcy, was able to, and this was this was the kind of stuff that the UP had been doing for 30 years. But this was one of the few tangible representations of what should have been done.
So yeah, this is a pretty interesting spot. This is late morning, so I drove from Dalhart about hour and a half up here to Kismet, Kansas, roughly.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
And so, and in the foreground, all that grass that's laying on its side is laying on its side I was sitting inside the car window for this shot. It was blustery, shall we say. And I got a good shot of the train and, a different train. So I got 2 trains on the bridge and fairly decent light. And so I considered that a victory.
Yeah.
And some local power here. Now, just back down the line west a little ways is Liberal. And they had some yard power here working. And so, and then here, Roy.
Yes, the depot at Liberal. A distinctly almost SP looking depot at Liberal.
And then this thing, which must have been like the hotel, I think.
Yeah, it would have been probably a hotel, maybe been some offices in there as well, and a beanery probably. But yes.
So here's that whole campus, and
nicely restored,
nicely preserved, nicely restored. We'll see some other nicely preserved stuff here in a second. It makes my little depot in Cle Elum look tiny. So, but yeah, I mean, and I don't know what they're doing with the space, but God, the buildings are in great shape.
Yeah.
So here's a local leaving town and an SP baggage car, right? That's kind of a non sequitur, isn't it, right?
Yeah, and that's one of the old SP economy bags, but I cannot explain its presence there in that color.
Yeah, I mean, a daylight scheme, and it should be a Golden State scheme.
Right. And
right?
Yeah. I mean, the Golden State was kind of that orange and
orange and silver, I think, something like that. Yeah.
But yeah, that I can't explain that car. That's
so this was last October, and you notice that kind of that bifurcated grain elevator in the background. So here's another shot. This is a J. Harlan Wilson shot, February 1977, with an SP and a couple of rocks and a bunch of pigs on the point, right?
Yeah. Nice
So,
shot.
yeah, wasn't that a great shot? Yeah, that was a good one. That's an eBay. I bought it on eBay. So there you go.
That was probably train 01, which was the successor and assigns to Rock Island's old 91, the Gold Streak. And by that time, it was a few pigs and empty reefers going back to Arizona and whatever other manifest Silvis or Armourdale could lay on the train.
Kind of the daily train, huh, Jack?
It was absolutely, and it was necessary to get the empties back home to where they could be reloaded.
Now, Jack, what was your involvement with the Kansas City division? Just real quick.
Well, I had been terminal superintendent at City of Industry and was transferred to Armourdale in what would have been 1985.
Mhm.
You had done all the hard work on getting the railroad back in shape. I'll tell you a slight war story, okay? I worked for the Rock Island for 3 years, and when I first went there, passed through Armourdale. The general manager was there and took a tour out to the yard, and then went on to Peoria, where I was trainmaster. When I went back in 1985 and walked into that Armourdale yard office, it smelled exactly the same as it did the first time I was there. And everybody on that property, with the exception of you and I and Bill Reeves, were
Right.
ex long haul Rock Island guys. It was, but they had all stared into the abyss, and they
Yes.
knew that they were in it was like resurrection.
Yes, indeed. Oh, amazing.
Does the town there remind you of that place where they filmed the Last Picture Show? I mean, just absolutely desolate looking.
It's more desolate further west, but
Yeah.
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 I
Yeah.
mean,
If you
just those
compare
plain
this-
looking streets.
I'm
What's
sorry.
that, George?
I was just saying the streets look so plain, they're just these buildings all kind of whitewashed or whatever, and they just everything looks like it's all abandoned, like an abandoned town or something.
Yeah,
The,
we got some good examples of that coming. So
the
Roy,
perpetual wind doesn't allow any trash to accumulate.
no, that's true. I mean, it is blustery. So Roy, did you ever run this plow?
I couldn't find the slide, but that wedge plow, that milk car tender, were the exact same piece of equipment that was a Liberal when I got there in April of 1981.
Well,
Same
4 years
place.
later, yeah. So
Yeah.
yeah, it's kind of cool. So it was a milk car, not a tender.
Well, no, it was the tender. It's just got that humpback look, milk car.
Yeah, it's got that humpback look to it. It is kind of a cool looking thing.
Oh, it's great tender.
And then this is Stratford. Now, Roy, why is the depot sideways to the tracks?
That's the Santa Fe depot. It crossed the Santa Fe crossed
Oh, okay.
the Rock Island there. One of the many at-grade crossings that I haven't been out there since you have. I presume they're all gone.
Yeah,
But
there's
that's
no trace of the Santa Fe here anymore.
right. Okay. Well, that was the Santa Fe's. That's the box car must be a park in a park kind of thing.
Yeah, I think the depot is preserved. It is like the local museum or the Elks Club. It looks like well, I don't know. It just says Elks on the water tank. So,
Yep.
Boxcar is white lined for condemned.
Yep. Sure
yep,
is.
yeah. And you can see the flag. It is getting to be a blustery day in West Texas. My God. And I'm in a Jeep Wrangler, which is like not a very wind stable car.
That was a good choice for a car, though. Nevertheless.
Well, it was a good choice when I was on the Cumberson Toltec the days before. So, anyway, we're back here in Dalhart. This is in the afternoon now, and this is a eastbound at the depot, getting ready to leave in the afternoon. So I presume, Roy, that these guys are blocking the diamonds with the
Oh
beam.
yes, he definitely would be hanging over the diamonds.
Yeah, he'd
That,
be
that
hanging
large
over the
grain
diamonds
elevator, that large grain elevator in the background is on the
on
Denver
the
on the
BN.
in Denver City. Yeah, this guy.
Right. So,
Yep.
and speaking of the BN, here they are. They were tying up. They got a lot of local traffic, and of course the limos there for them. So a couple of SD40s. Yeah, they got a bunch of local traffic up and down the line. This thing was sitting out. You can see in the background, way in the background, the BN train. This was out at an ADM mill. I don't. What are those lights for, Roy?
That to me looks like it's intended to switch an industry by remote control, an old style remote control where the feedback to the operator was displayed by external lights rather than having a more sophisticated gauge like a good weather control cab, like a current CANAC system.
Okay,
So it's
yeah,
pretty
I don't know that this thing is still in service, but it's deep in the heart of Texas, still sitting there gathering sagebrush. So then the next morning, I had a chance to catch a train at dawn at Logan, and this is the Canadian River. And of course, the question came up when Roy and I were talking about this. Given the stream flow, which you can barely see, why would you have these gigantic foundations? And the answer is that a municipality dammed the Canadian River just west of here and uses that impounded water for a municipal water supply. So what used to be coursing through the Canadian River is now coursing through somebody's faucet. So, but great shot and
Yes.
KCS leader, beautiful morning. I mean, gosh, it was,
Very
yeah.
unusual.
And,
Seldom seen photograph.
and they're just kind of like putting. They're doing like, 25 or 30. I mean, they're not, and of course going across the bridge. You don't need to go blazing across the bridge, but yeah, they're going at a pretty, reasonable space, and the crew's friendly. They gave me a wave here, they're doing about 25 or 30. And here's Tucumcari, New Mexico. So George, back to your comment, what I really should have done is taken a picture of what was behind me, because there's an entire town of Tucumcari, this whole downtown, blocks and blocks and blocks and blocks of brick buildings, and every single one of them is boarded up. Every single one of them. It's like the TV show, which I've never really watched, Breaking Bad. I mean, you're so far out, they don't even have graffiti. It's so
Maybe the
far.
mayor is Brian Cranston.
I can say I don't. But look at this depot. My God, it's just magnificent and very nicely restored. Roy, there's a signal on the left and a signal in the middle. Are those both SP signals or rock signals, or do you know?
They appear to be the one in the foreground is a distant signal, with
Okay.
the little wedge out of the middle of it.
Oh, okay.
That's a distant signal. That's not a block signal. It's a distant signal for like a crossing.
Okay. So like an approach.
Right. And its most permissive aspect would be a caution. Here it's just like stop. But anyway, the other one back there, I guess I have to confess I didn't notice, Jonathan, in this
Yeah.
picture.
I think they're like
Okay.
old SP signal to me, but
Okay. Yeah,
I don't
right.
really know.
But,
And here's another picture. You're going to see those signals in the background. And George, you look in the background, like I say, it's just desolation in all directions. It's weird because it's such a cool building in a just otherwise like abandoned highways and streets with no cars. And anyway, so here's that train. Now we're west.
I like the arch lettering on the end.
Oh yeah, isn't that nice? Standing off the building, it's a very nicely restored.
Yeah.
And there's a museum there, but sadly it was closed when I was there. So right now we're on that stretch of track between Tucumcari and Santa Rosa. So this was Rock Island track, but least to the SP.
Yeah, you mean the next picture?
Yeah, this one right.
I've still got the depot up here.
Oh, should have advanced.
There we are.
Okay.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah. The El Paso and Northeastern was building up that way because there was a lot of coal in the Dawson coal fields north of Tucumcari, and they wanted to get that coal. And so but they struck a deal with the Rock Island and leased the track rather than build a duplicate track. Who needs a duplicate track up there?
Especially out here. I mean, it's like the El Paso at Southwestern and the SP in Arizona. It's just like, why? But it seemed like once you get
Right.
west of Tucumcari, it's not straight and flat anymore, right?
Mm-mm. No.
Yeah.
This is where the 6,700 foot elevation is out on
Yeah.
this line. And it was kind of interesting because after the Kansas City division was rehabbed and was fluid and running trains, this became the bottleneck because they didn't have anything up there much more than a 6,000 foot siding, and
Right.
they needed bigger siding. So this district had to get rehabbed too. So it goes.
Yes, George.
I had a question for Roy about the cruise. So did the SP cruise run all the way to Tucumcari, or did they trade train? Oh, they did. Okay.
Yes, they
I
did.
thought they did, but I remember that, that they
Yeah,
did
yeah.
run on
They
rock.
ran El Paso to Carrizozo and Carrizozo to Tucumcari.
Yeah.
Oh,
Yeah. Okay.
Carrizosa.
Thank you.
Oh, okay.
Mhm.
I didn't know that. This is just right off the interstate. I'm following the train, and you could get back on the old highway and take a picture of it, and then get back on the highway and get ahead of it. And here I just parked alongside of the highway and got a picture of it going across this kind of cute little bridge. I'm just standing on the shoulder of the freeway, and semi trucks are zooming by. So,
Mhm.
and then here we are. This is, I believe, the Pecos River in Santa Rosa, New Mexico. And
Yeah,
this would have been where the end of that track would have been.
yeah, yeah,
So there you go.
yeah.
And that blah, can't talk. That wraps up our second feature, folks. So there you
Nice,
go.
Jonathan. Nice
Um,
stuff, Jonathan.
yeah, that was a fun trip. That was a fun trip. Oh, it could be the U.S. Route 66 Museum. That's a possibility.
Mhm.
Okay,
Okay,
I'm gonna try one more time. Jack Christensen, are you there? Seeing if Jack can hear me. Have a little drum roll or some music or something in the interlude while we're waiting to see if Jack can come.
Hey, Jack.
Well, we
Need
tried.
a sign. You might need to actually, not to be unkind, but just you might need a little signboard to
Jack say something. So he might have, Anyway, it's just great having Jack on the program, and I always want to make sure I say hi to him every chance I get. And just he's a very dear friend, and Jack and I have done a lot of really great programs together on his time on the Northern Pacific. And so it's always good to see him on the program at age 99. So anyway, we're going to wrap up today's program at 2:20 p.m. Pacific time. And I want to thank everybody for being here. Our special guest, Roy Gelder. Roy, this was as good as I remember. We did this program back in August of 23, and this is a reprisal,
well,
second
thanks
time.
for the supplemental new content.
You
It's
know,
awesome.
yeah. So before we go, I'd be amiss if we didn't do a quick, weather check around the country. I'll let Roy handle Chicago, Steve. So Roy, what's it like there?
Oh well, yes, and as Steve mentioned, it's an unusually cool May day, but we got some rain, and we're glad to have the rain. It's been dry, as you know. We had our first dust storm in like 40 years a few days ago.
Yeah, I
So
saw that
yeah, so
paper.
we're glad
Yeah.
for the rain. It's all good.
All right. Jack Fuller, I don't know where you are, sir, so tell us what it's like there weather-wise.
78 degrees in the East Bay of California and sunny, and it will be like that, I guess, for the next 6 months, except it'll get warmer.
There you go. All right.
Jack, do you live near Ozell?
About 25 minutes away. Yes.
All right. Yeah. I was just going
Ozil?
to tell everybody that when I worked for Jack, it was only occasionally because I borrowed out there at Oakland, and then I would deadhead to Ozell to go to work.
Well,
Ozil
George,
by
while
the
you're on the
bay.
line, what's it like in Hermiston?
Hermiston is 69 and beautiful. Well, kind of windy, and that doesn't mean that it's talking about me.
Of course not. Jack Fuller, did you have something more you wanted to add?
No, that's fine.
All right, very good, sir. Didn't mean to cut you off. Trent Stetz in the Rose City, Portland, Oregon. What's it like there, sir?
68 and beautifully sunny.
Wonderful.
68 and beautifully sunny. Yeah.
There we got you. There we got you. Joel McCurry in Cary, North Carolina. What's it like there, Joel?
We got 83 and sunny today.
Oh, there you go. And humid, I'm thinking too, right? You getting a little humidity?
Uh, yeah, a little bit today.
All right, there you go. Anybody else want to chip in quick before we go with their weather conditions? If I miss somebody and you feel strongly you want to tell me, it's a beautiful day here in West Seattle. It's low 60s and getting to be a spring day. And like I say, I'll be out next week doing some field work. And hopefully we'll have a couple interesting pictures for our next visit in 2 weeks, where we're going to have hopefully Robert W. Scott and Bethan Mayer as our guests. So, George Foster, you got anything more before I let you go?
If possible, could you do an introduction with Kurt Armbruster and I, like we did with the other thing with Steve House?
Yeah, I'd be happy
Because
to.
I want to be up in the Seattle area sometime later in the summer, and I'd like to meet with Kurt, either at the foundation there or some other way, just
Yeah, I'd be happy to do that. Yeah, Kurt is the editor of the Northern Pacific Streamliner magazine, a very, very nice publication. So
okay, good.
there you go. All right.
Thank you.
Okay, so I got George's last comments in for this week. And so I'm going to say have a safe Memorial Day weekend. Okay, everybody. And let's remember the importance of Memorial Day. Why we remember these people and what they did for us and where we are today. So let's show a little gratitude, everybody. And on that happy note, I'll look forward to seeing everybody again in 2 weeks. In the meantime, like I say, stay safe and bye for now.